When I bought my house at the edge of a quiet rural development, I thought the hardest part of owning property would be maintaining the land. I had no idea that the real battle would begin when my homeowners association decided that my family farm was somehow theirs. The property had belonged to my grandfather for decades before the surrounding development was even planned. There was an old farmhouse, a large barn, several acres of open pasture, a private gravel road, and a line of trees that had marked the eastern boundary for as long as anyone in the area could remember. When my grandfather passed away, the property eventually came to me, and I spent years restoring the farmhouse while continuing to use the land for a small cattle operation. The neighborhood around me had changed dramatically, but my property had remained separate. Then one Monday morning, I found a letter from the HOA taped to my front door. It claimed that my farm was subject to community rules and that I had violated HOA regulations by keeping livestock, storing equipment, and maintaining structures that supposedly interfered with the appearance of the neighborhood. I laughed when I first read it because the farm had existed long before the HOA. But the next sentence stopped me cold. The letter said the HOA considered part of my land to be community property and demanded that I remove my livestock within 30 days. I immediately called the HOA office and asked them to explain exactly what they meant. The property manager told me the association had reviewed its maps and believed that a portion of my acreage had been incorporated into the development when the neighborhood was created. I asked her for the survey. She said the HOA board would provide documentation later. That answer made no sense. I had purchased the property using a recorded deed, paid taxes on every acre, and had a professional survey completed when I built a new storage barn. Nothing had ever suggested that the HOA owned any portion of my farm. A few days later, 2 HOA board members showed up at my gate with a printed map. They pointed to roughly 3 acres of pasture and told me those acres were technically part of a future community greenbelt. I asked them where the boundary markers were. They couldn't answer. I asked them why I had been paying property taxes on that land. They couldn't answer that either. Finally, I asked them to show me the document transferring ownership to the HOA. They simply said their attorney was reviewing the matter. That was when I stopped treating the situation like a misunderstanding. I contacted a property attorney and gave him every document I had. He examined my deed, my grandfather's deed, the previous surveys, property tax records, and the development plans. After several hours, he told me something that completely changed the situation. My property had never been transferred to the HOA. In fact, the original development plan clearly showed my farm as a separate parcel. The 3 acres the HOA claimed belonged to the community were explicitly excluded from the development's common areas. But there was something even more interesting. The original developer had apparently discussed purchasing part of the farm decades earlier but never completed the transaction. The HOA had apparently found an old planning map and treated it as if it were proof of ownership. They had ignored the recorded deeds and surveys. My attorney sent the board a formal notice demanding that they stop making ownership claims against my property. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then the HOA escalated. They sent another letter saying I was required to remove the cattle because livestock violated community standards. They also threatened fines if I refused to comply. I knew then that they weren't simply confused. They were trying to establish control through pressure. Instead of arguing with the board, I went back through the county records. My grandfather had kept boxes of documents in the attic, and I remembered seeing an old folder marked with the original parcel number. Inside was a document that none of us had looked at in years. It was the original recorded deed from before the development existed. It described the exact acreage and specifically identified the western boundary using a creek and a line of mature oak trees. My attorney compared that description with the current survey. The boundaries matched perfectly. The 3 acres the HOA claimed were unquestionably part of my parcel. The most powerful evidence, however, came from an old development agreement. The developer had signed a document acknowledging that my farm would remain privately owned and would not become part of the neighborhood's common property unless a separate conveyance was executed. There had never been such a conveyance. The HOA had essentially built its entire claim on an assumption. It's a piece of paper that was recorded decades before the HOA ever existed.